Good evening, everybody. It's, I suppose, a little known fact that in the Great Fire of 1842, which devastated a third of the city of Hamburg in 3 days, there were riots afterwards because there was a group of English and Irish navvies building a railway nearby, and the citizens of Hamburg blamed them for conspiring to start the fire. So, and this is very embarrassing for Hamburg, which has always considered itself to be friendly English, but fires and conspiracy theories seem to go together somehow. And this, I think, is the clue to our guest speaker's interest in conspiracies, because his previous book has been about fires, in the dangers of fires in cities, towns in the early modern period, not just in Europe, but in other parts of the world as well. And the measures that people took to prevent them in future, and including, for example, the banning of smoking in the streets in Berlin in the 1848 revolution was one of the first signs of disorder that workers started going up to policemen and deliberately kind of smoking and then blowing smoke in their face. It's a very important topic that's on the borderlines of environmental history, institutional history, history of risk taking and risk management, insurance, and many other things. That's his most recent book. That's his second doctorate, because our poor German colleagues have to do 2 and not just 1, as we do. He's an associate professor at the University of Bochum, the Ruhr-Universität Bochum, which I went to some years ago, and I have to say it's almost as ugly as the University of Essex. But
you're completely right.
And he's also now has a wonderful 2-year Marie Curie Fellowship at the University of Harvard, where he's studying, and he's going to talk to us about knowledge gaps, the early modern foundations of conspiracy and democracy. So, Cornel Zwierlein.
Yeah, thank you, Richard Evans, very much for that invitation to crash to the Conspiracy and Democracy project. Thank you to everyone in Cambridge for a conspiring and already inspiring meeting and coming together here. So community building is quite easy and quick in Cambridge, I learned. And so conspiring and community building will also be the subject of my talk. So thank you to everyone, Andrew, Rachel, Hugo, Alfred, and so on, Simon Gold, who's not there. So I start with, whoops, it's going like that, so that will be the lecture. And first, I want to distinguish between real conspiracies and conjurations, which happened in history, between historical narratives about those events, and between conspiracy theories as explanatory narratives which circulate in a given media environment or early public sphere as a historical agent of its own right. So 3 different things. And this simple distinction is not always done in the related literature, but it is quite important. Implying it, I would judge that we know of many real conspiracies and conjurations in ancient classical Greece and Rome, that there are classical accounts of them, at least for the Roman part in Salus de Conjuratione Catilini, which we all know, but that are no conspiracy theories transmitted to us that would have circulated in the ancient semi-public sphere. The second remark is that seemingly also the European Middle Ages do not know conspiracy theories at all, or at least no secular conspiracy theories communicated widely in a translocal form. That can be disputed, and I have exceptions to show, but in a general way I would say that is not existing at that time. So this fact in itself is strange and necessitates an explanation, and this explanation is something which I try to do, recurring to the emergence and the history of the emergence of early modern long-distance communication and the early modern information public sphere, not a normal public sphere, as you know it from Enlightenment times. But let's first make another very simple distinctions, which you could derive from any ancient and contemporary dictionaries, but which point to very important differences, and in the semantic tradition related to it. So now I'm coming to the first point, where I make that distinction between the older positive conjuratio of the pre-modern times, the conjunctions of real negative conjurations or conjurations in early modern Europe and the contemporary reflections about that. The positive term and so both terms, conjuratio and conspiracy, are certainly old ones from Latin antiquity, swearing together and coming together on the one side, under one spirit, but they refer also to very important elements of the information of the formation of medieval and early modern societies. The positive term and the practice of conjuratio is taken by many important researchers like Gierke, Genossenschaftsrecht, for those who know that from German 19th century history, Paolo Prodi and Blickle and others, as one of the most important foundations of pre-modern societies at all, especially of pre-modern communities, cities and villages. It was quite literally a conjurare, a swearing together, that was in question in those times. The foundation of a city itself was thought of or even practiced as such a swearing together. For those who have been in Germany, the southwestern parts, or in Switzerland, the Ulmer Schwörhaus is something which is still present there, but it is a thing which happened also in France and in England also, because even the Corporation of London is something like that, which is a conjuratio, a swearing together of the body politic of a city. So the conjuratio is formed to create a space and sphere of peace. If someone is harming that peace, he is to be punished. Normally the conjuratio is reiterated and reactivated periodically, and normally that is once a given day in the year. The negative term and practice of conjuratio is the adoption of the principle of society building against itself, a part of the city which is as a whole a conjuratio of burghers conjures against that conjuratio. The term conspiratio was first of all a positive term in classical Latin. Cicero used it in his letters. It's an influence of Greek philosophy, of Epicurean and Stoic descendants, and it means the gathering together of friends under one common spirit. So it's a very positive community building idea in the first place. Cicero, and in classical Latin, conspiratio is quite never used for telling us something about the negative conjuratio, like the conjuratio Catiline. If Cicero is talking about that, he uses conjuratio. That is quite divided in the ancient and pre-modern use of language. The negative term, conspiratio and conspiracy, is now the leading term for us, and so we should have a little bit closer look on that. Well, I come later to that manuscript. The first I will treat the conjunctions of real negative conjurations as research has mapped it until now. There are some volumes about that which I'm just giving here in a rough summary. The formation of a group that wanted to revolt and act against the existing regime could gather and transform itself spontaneously into a conjuratio. So the typical early modern conjuration is rather the destabilizing conjuratio within a conjuratio. It is the application of the general horizontal medieval principle of community building against itself in a certain way. Many of those conjurations you know, the Genovian Fieschi or the Florentine Pazzi conjuration, which were later taken on in 19th century opera even. We could do a certain kind of historical geography of Europe regarding the use and the frequency of those conjurations. For Italian city republics like Genova and Florence, the conjura was constitutive and frequent in its both meanings, but less, for example, in Venice, which is forming one of the parts of the myth of Venice, that the stability of Venice was so big that conjurations and conjura were not so often to be found. Conjuration events in the meaning of revolt were also less frequent and typical for the territorial republican systems like the Netherlands and the Swiss cantons. In Central Europe and elsewhere, urban revolts and rebellions became much less frequent since the end of the 16th century. So during the early modern age, the typical idea that an urban revolt has taken place after in a certain kind of frequency in the city itself is faded down by the more and more autocratic state who's empowering and who's just pressuring down those conjurations in the city itself. in most of the territorial states, so conjurations, as you all know, are linked to revolts and rebellions between the crown and the nobles of the estates of those territories. So the question is now how the contemporaries reflected themselves on the negative conjuratio, which was treated mostly under the label rather of seditio, as sedition. And for that I'm doing a little bit, not being Foucault, but like Foucault, who always takes a bit of something which has nothing to do with the big, something like, he's not citing Montesquieu, but any spacey author which no one knows. So when I profited from your invitation here, using some manuscripts for completely different things in the Library of Cambridge, I came across a manuscript which fitted well into the lecture, so I used it. But it's a letter of a certain John Littleton, completely unknown to us, or very difficultly to identify. But the letter is from the 1620s and early 1630s, and Mr. Littleton was asked to give to his friend some information about what is a sedition and a revolt. So he went into the library and did what I should have done. He searched what in 1620s, 1630s was the theory about seditio and sedition. And he uses, it seems to be that he's a Catholic, he's an English Catholic, and that means he's belonging to part and probably also to a family who as a family itself made conjurations against Elizabeth around 1600. So it's a nice person, because there is a Littleton family which was conspiring and plotting spirits at that time, in plotting movements at that time. And he uses in fact only Catholic authors: Thomas Aquinas, Gregor de Valencia, Conrad Brown, Abraham Conson, a Bavarian lawyer, James I Basilicon Doron, so there we pass to England, and Francis Bacon, and the civil law, so Roman law. And then he tries to get out of that theory of what is seditio at that time. There's probably a crucial reversal of perspective present in that communication, as here a letter writer who himself belongs to a Catholic minority in a Protestant, dominantly Protestant kingdom, informs himself and his partner about the legitimacy of seditions by citing authors who themselves had rather Protestant revolts and minorities in their mind when they denied the legitimacy of revolt against a Catholic majority. So that's a typical phenomenon in that age, like the Catholic monarchomax borrowed from the Calvinists and vice versa. Someone who is in the position of defense can be the oppressor in the next moment and vice versa. If you would have used Calvinist author like Knox, de Bèze, Vindiquier, Althusius, Keckermann, the result would not have been very different, I would say, because what he is tearing out of it is rather a skeleton of notions and something like an early etymology or Begriffsgeschichte in 1620-30. Littleton findings, if we just take his what he's tearing out, is that a sedition occurs when one part of the res publica revolts against another part or against the prince. We have here the common pre-modern use of republic as res publica, which you may translate rather with state or commonwealth than with republic in the modern sense. And Littleton then just distinguishes the sedition as secular from the schism, from a riot as collective, and from a war as internal affair, while the war is always a foreign affair between two commonwealths. He makes a systematical error himself, because he should have put there populi ad populum and not multitudines ad multitudinem, but you will see that why I'm pointing to that. For me, it's important that normally he's using here the term multitudo and not the populus. And that's a Ciceronian definition which he's using, which is quite important at that point, and which we are even seeing at the end of the lecture in postmodern times. He's citing the definition of Cicero of res publica: e civitas quae populus it coetus non quilibet, sed juris consensu et utilitatis communione sociatus. So the most important definition of Cicero to define a republic is that this is a res publica, res populi, and that the populace is not any gathering of people, but it is a gathering of a multitude under a law, under a common law. So the combination of those two parts is very important. And the other side of the populus would be the multitudo. So the pre-constituted society is the multitudo. So if you reflect about conjurations, seditions in early modern time, you have to reflect about the people in its pre-constituted state of being, the multitudo, not the populus. The sedition or conjuration resets a given community to the point zero of non-constitution of a pre-constituted assembly. A sedition conjuration is an action that is directed just against the law, the justice, and the public utility, which transform the multitude into a populus, and which found the civitas. So the conjuration in the negative sense annihilates the effects of the conjuration in a positive sense and lets reappear the multitude, which otherwise is not to be seen, because a constitution is just a constitution, and a republic is a republic which is constituted. So that's my first point. And at that point we have gathered some ideas about how early modern theories about conjuration, conspiracy are described by contemporaries. Now I'm trying to explain how the emergence of that, what we have not spoken about yet, conspiracy theories happen at that time. To explain to explain historically how early modern conspiracy theories are emerging, I have first to make a definition of it. And there I'm a little bit in dispute with our discussion of last Wednesday, because I would say you still have to have a good definition of something if you want to historicize it and if you want to get an idea of how to explain its emergence in history. But that's perhaps on a historical point of view. So to deepen that reflection, I will first ask, what is a conspiracy history? What is a conspiracy theory? And and I come back here to a definition which is quite used at that time by Keeley from 1999. A conspiracy theory is a proposed explanation of some historical event or events in terms of the significant causal agency of a relatively small group of persons, the conspirators acting in secret. It proffers an explanation of the event in question. It proposes reasons why the event occurred. Keeley's definition has been criticized not only by me but by others. I cannot give all the history of that, but I just pointed to major problems. It is not helpful to reduce conspiracy theories to their explanatory function. They have surely also an appellative and a propaganda function, and Keeley's definition does not take into account many other elements discussed in literature, and it lacks, foremost, that's my problem, a sense for the problems of historicization. Other authors have pointed out other theories and criteria of conspiracy theories, which I'm not coming back to, but we can discuss that later on. The crucial deficit of the definition for me is the rather ahistorical status. And if we would content ourselves with the explanatory function of the conspiracy theory, what makes the difference between a normal rational historical explanation, which historians do, and a conspiracy theory? So if, for example, a highly talented group of historians like the Crash Team as historians would have, after thorough empirical investigation, formed a narrative, a historical narrative, that explains why a past event happened by proving that the revealed plan of a small group of men which has been executed indeed, this would not be a conspiracy theory in our mind, but it would fulfill Keeley's definition, unwillingly, or unwillingly perhaps. So it is wise to concentrate on the medium, the form of the text itself. A conspiracy theory is typically a narrative of a possible past constructed with the material of a great amount of facts that have really happened and that are commonly accepted as real, and with other fictitious or at least not proven and not commonly accepted elements which are just supposed to have happened. So the difference between a conspiracy theory and fiction is the Popperian claim, is that the claim that it has really happened, And the difference of a conspiracy theory between factuality is that it is not provable, so that would be the Popperian argument. Conspiracy theories lie so epistemologically in the middle between factual history and literary fictional writing. And that leads to the point that if you want to historicize them, you have to look, you have to be aware and sensible for the narrative medium, and you have to be aware for that what I call here the sense of reality of the given society at that point, because that is the thing which you have to historicize also. You have to historicize the representation of reality and its perception mode, and to do that I apply communication history, because that is changing our perception. Okay? I have developed that argument much longer in that little special issue. Not everything which I'm talking about is in that, so you hear something new, but the definition comes from that, and it is quite long and so not very elegant. But as definitions who are not elegant, they tend to be narrow, and narrower definitions have the advantage to be closer and to be better objects of precise historicization. So I will not read everything, but just the beginning. A conspiracy theory is a narrative of possible past and present, often containing also elements of future predictions, claiming to be the true representation of the past and present, which is built from some commonly accepted elements, facts, sequential and causal relationships, and some elements that are not proven but possible and that bridge the gaps of knowledge and understanding concerning a certain event or a sequence of events. The possibility, and that's why the plausibility to function as formative element of the narrative depends on the character of the representation of reality in the given society, in the form of distinction between fiction and factuality. The rest you can see here. So now back to history. That's our definition, and with that we can start something like a clear-cut historicization. So I come now to the emergence of the early modern information public sphere. The main argument for why fully developed conspiracy narratives as independent agents in political communication only emerged during the 16th century is that they are referring to a representation of reality which was only at hand as early as the early modern information public sphere had emerged. We are considering here the information public sphere for all those who have the association with Habermas. Habermas has rather nothing said about that. It is a new development in historical sciences about the discussion of information public sphere rather in early modern, for the early modern periods after the years 2000, 2006. I've contributed a little bit to that, but I will just give a bullet point-like skeleton of the argument. The argument is that since 1450 in Italy, with the Sforza, developed the new interterritorial diplomatic state communication, which was restricted quite strictly to state and public affairs. Only men of politics and diplomats had access to the information circulating here. And a century later, between 1520 and 1550, a new outsourcing of anonymous news communication took place. Unemployed secretaries and diplomats crowded the bigger Italian cities during and mostly after the Italian wars in the main centers of communication like Venice and Rome, and they had still access to the diplomatic news communication or established their own. And they, using the old context, or tapped into the postal relay system to get letters, information letters, and then they copied the news parts of letters and combined them to specialized newsletters, lettere de avvisi, which we have here. So that's a very early one, and we see here that the author is writing a summary of letters that came at that time and that he had at that time, at that moment at his place. And then it is formulated in indirect narrative. Lettere redutte contengono che. So those letters which I have cited contain that. So you see in those passages that he's really declaring overtly that he's doing a patchwork of news and putting together like that something which we would call an early newspaper. A little bit later, that is going to be professionalized in the 16th century from 1550s onwards. And then we have the German handwritten newsletter, which is a copy of the Italian one. And then we have the diffusion system of the postal relay system, which is looking like that, more or less, which is spreading onwards through the centuries afterwards. So that's just the beginning of the 1550s to 1600. And afterwards, I mean, it is plural. There's a big pluralization, and you can go on every knot of that postal relay system and try to show and try to find in the archives where are the copies of those newsletters, and that would be for one of those nodal points, Cologne, the diffusion of the letters that one early proto-journalist has written and sent from that point out to the others. So that creates a distinct political communication circuit, which itself is observing the political communication of the interterritorial diplomatic system. If you want so, it is the state himself who has created that public sphere. It is something like a non-intended outsourcing effect of the state's communication itself, who is creating the public sphere, and that is a point which is never to be seen in Habermas. It's a steadily communicated observation of observers. This Avisior news communication, which emerges quite precisely around 1550, is transferred then to the Northern Europes, and it informs about the present state of political affairs in trans-regional in a European-wide sense. In my vision, that is something which is from the centuries onwards just being structurally very equivalent even until the 19th century, if you want. So even the printed newspaper is built upon that handwritten newsletter system, so that comes out quite precisely at that point, and then it's just widening but not changing in structure. To characterize now more systematically that impact on the perception of actors, we may say that the information public sphere creates a perception of A, the continually changing positions on the chessboard of Europe of political actors. In that time, that was the metaphor of the Theatrum Europae, with their own internal logic, and B, the structure of the perception that all political and reportable actors, including kings, also experience themselves as observers observed by the anonymous, independently communicating circuit. That generates, consciously or unconsciously, an impression among the observers, which one might initially call a system inclusion, and at the same time a system instability experience, in which can be described by certain characteristics. A, the consciousness of the integration of the actors into a larger conglomerate characterized by dynastic, political, confessional, or economic logics of connection and division. B, the planability and at the same time limitation of this planability by system contingencies in this field. C, the consciousness of connections and causal, conditional interdependencies over large areas. The information public sphere enables a quiet consciousness to emerge that there are superordinate factors and interdependencies which may be difficult to trace, understand or predict, but to which all actors, even the most powerful in Europe of that time, are subject. That clearly none of the visible actors has complete control of the system anymore. So there's a system instability and at the same time an interdependency perception. This initially opens up a new emotional space to be filled with fear and worry about the security and stability of the whole and its part. It is only in this space that modern conspiracy theories can then introduce supercausal instances which are now giving the causality above something which in the first time in the newsletter production is just an agglomeration of contingencies. So let's have a look on two conspiracy narratives that fit perfectly into our earlier definition and link it to the problem of the communication and the information public sphere. So And very early, you know, I'm happy to show you very early things, but you see that you can extract from that quite general things. A very early conspiracy theory looks like that. It's a German one. It's a 3-folio text from spring 1567, which circulated in Europe and which was related to the French and Dutch wars of religion. Since a 2-week meeting in 1565 at Bayonne between Charles IX and the king's mother Catherine de' Medici on the French side and the Duke of Alba and the Spanish Queen Elizabeth, the Protestants feared a great master plan of Catholic European powers to finally put an end to Protestantism and to reconquer Europe for Catholicism. Until today, we do not know much about that meeting at Bayonne. I mean, the big Catholic powers meet together, but probably they just drank a little bit of coffee. We don't know very much about what happened at that time. Very surely no Catholic master plan to reorganize Europe existed at that time, like a Roosevelt-Churchill-Stalin pact on the repetition of post-Nazi Europe, but that was technically even impossible at that time. But the conspiracy theory here is just formulating the idea that at that point 17 articles would have been formulated to reorganize Europe in a new Catholic way, like that. The general plan of the Catholic forces headed by the Pope would be first to exchange all Protestant princes for Catholic ones. The emperor would be transformed into a hereditary monarchy. All dominions of princes that had not joined the alliance should be sequestered and transferred to the emperor. The war against the Protestants should be taken on. The King of Scotland should be reinthroned. Queen Elizabeth should be hunted out of England. So you have, it goes even longer. It's one of the first forms of something like what you know from England as the Popish plots, as the well-known idea of a Catholic conspiracy, which is always coming among us. But on a pan-European level, and something like an ideal type of that vision, because it is referring to every region in Europe. And we can see now that the author, the anonymous author of that conspiracy theory, is pointing to very, very detailed knowledge of the movements of this prince to that court at a certain moment, a dynastic marriage of that with the other, and using that knowledge for building up of that his conspiracy narrative. So it is clearly referring to a knowledge only to be gained of the lecture of daily and weekly coming in newspapers at the time. So 40 years before, that would not have been possible in whole Europe to write such a text. So that's the interesting point of that, and that's the direct link to the news information public sphere which emerged. If we add just one element, then we have it all for the early modern times, I would say, because you have only to add now the Antichrist, and you have the second type of early modern conspiracy theories. Those are two pamphlets circulating after the St. Bartholomew's massacre, which was typical. Which was one of the big massacres in the French Wars of Religions. And you have here the Conspiratio Pontifica, and you have here the Antichrist. That's a picture of the Antichrist as Luther had formed him with his double-bind head. So with the Ottoman Emperor and the Pope, that was always the idea of Luther, that those two formed together the Antichrist in our last days. And that's the angel of the second letter of the Thessalonians of St. Paul, where it's said that the Antichrist, when he's coming on our world, is hiding behind the face of an angel, and he is unmasking him only at the very last moment. So this is really and properly the picture of the Antichrist. And now what was added to our newsletter feeded communication of conspiracy theories is just the causal actor of the temporal biblical time horizon of the Last Judgment time, that we are just in the moment of the apocalypse, and that the Antichrist is the one who is just leading like the supercausal instance above all those movements of the princes and so on, that he is behind everything. And it's quite literally to found in those pamphlets at that time. It is rather fading down in the 17th century, so it is it is more prominent and more clearly to be found at that time than later on. So those are the two types, I would say, of early modern conspiracy theories. I would call the first one the conspiracy theory of the news matching plausibility, and B, the type of the modern apocalyptic plausibility type. I'm coming now to what is theoretical more challenging, to the developments. I've explained the emergence of the early modern conspiracy narrative with the contemporary emergence of the information public sphere and the changes of the reality representation and time horizon caused by that. Many will not agree, but I would say that before the electronic communication, there was no big change of the media history. From a media history point of view, all what is coming even in the Enlightenment is a growth, expansion, pluralization, acceleration, improvement, but not a real change of that what was already present around 1600. Only electronic media introduce really new performances. They allow real-time bidirectionality and instant communication. But we have a changing on the other part of the story of the conspiracy theories, because we have now something really new, conspiracy theories which are coming up with the French Revolution, as we all know from Furet, Hunt, Tackett and others. So the revolutionary conspiracy thinking, as you know in that project very well, had a dialectic form, which was something like the inverse effect of the Rousseauian social contract thinking. Since the revolution imagined the new society to be formed by a metaphysical social contract thinking, by an indivisible general will, they necessarily imagined every real or supposed action against that general will to be a similar, single, indivisible, pervasive enemy, and imagined a death struggle with his opposite, whose supposed power and coherence vastly exaggerated the tangible evidence. We could say in a rather Schmittian way that the dichotomy of struggle between the true church and the Antichrist as mastermind operator during the confessional age was replaced now by the secularized dichotomy of revolutionary civil society on the one hand and the counter-revolutionary conspiracies of traditionalism and despotism on the other. Conspirators are une faction d'ennemis de la liberté. We read in hundreds of texts at the time of conspiration created by an Austrian committee, by une secte de conspirateurs, by philanthropists, by 50,000 brigands, by the Jacobins, by Louis XVI and his followers. And later also by Robespierre himself, who was said to have made himself king. So we have a new kind of conspiracy theory which is completely different from the confessional age, and how we can now organize an explanatory historical long-term narrative concerning the emergence and development of conspiracy thinking, like the difference between the types of the first confessional period to the types of the revolutionary era. As Hugo and Andrew know, I like to refer at that point to Koselleck, Kritik und Krise, very old book, which he wrote in 1959, and referring to Carl Schmitt without buying everything from Carl Schmitt. To bring it just in a few words, we'll come back to that. Koselleck's scheme of that development, he's not pointing just to conspiracy theory, but in general to the movement from confessional age to the modern era, is that a double shift of neutralizations or a double shift of epochs done by a dialectical dissolution of further states of being. The Hobbesian, so to speak, state as a neutral ruling power supersedes the confessional parties of war. The state had, with its bourgeois functional elite, so mainly lawyers, created a successful counterpower against the, in some cases, confessionally divided estates and nobles. With its bourgeois functional elite, however, the state at the same time created its own eventual destroyer in a second dialectical process. The citizens founded a morality which was separate from politics, a society which was separated from the state and apparently initially neutral, and above all created the bourgeois utopia of human development which ultimately leads to the dissolution of the state. And for Koselleck, who lived in the times of the Cold War, the idea was that this war between teleological progressive ideologies 1 and teleological progressive ideologies 2n is still proceeding until his time. So neoliberal democracies and communisms are fighting against each other. That's an Hegelian dialectic which I'm not subscribing in a certain way, because he is lacking at that time many points. He has no idea for distinct notions for the entities of a media environment, the perception, discourse, institutions, and structures. So he does not divide that, and always put everything rather in the matching of dialectics, if you want, so to explain what happens. What I have done until now is just to give something different. I have put the media development in the position of the explanatory force, which is explaining the emergence of the information, which is explaining how the information public sphere is created, how that changes perception on that side, and how by that two types of conspiracy narratives in a very different form in confessional age can emerge for the first time in history. And now to go beyond Koselleck and to explain also the, sorry, I'm not used to that, to come also to the Enlightenment. My point was that if we look now on the side of the media development, we do not find a very big change on that side. So it is hard to say or to have the idea that on the side of the media development there is the causal factor that might change so much around 1800 that might be the change of revolution, enlightenment, and also the forming of the new type of conspiracy narratives which are creating that new type of observability between modern society and the ancien regime on the one part and on the other. While the others, while the first moment was the observability of religion versus politics and vice versa. So but the problem is that we don't have a big change on that side. So I would say this is a rather involutive thing which is happening on the side of the discourses and on the side of enlightenment itself, on enlightenment discussion, but not on the side of the media development. For me, at that point, I would say that democracy is coming in certainly with a revolution, because the conspiracy narratives of the modern bourgeois society, which is observing the ancien regime, is a democratic, in a certain way, a democratic conspiracy narrative, which is coming up for the first time. But otherwise, I would say it is not that important, because conspiracy theories, in a certain way, as they emerge from the 16th century onwards, are rather directed against the constitution itself, against the order itself. So that's why, for me, the very first citation of the binôme between multitudo and communio, or multitudo and populus, is so important, because that's more general than the question of one form of government is threatened, while the conspiracy theory, which is coming up with the modern times, is rather a new thing which is circulating against the order at all. So, for giving a little outlook, which I cannot do as an historian, but that's perhaps an idea where you can pick up some ideas from that historical long-term perspective on your work. If I put it just very broadly, I would say the major ongoing revolutions of inclusionism across the famous borders of class, race, gender, 19th, 20th century still copy, pluralize, or fulfill the patterns of modern society formation of our second step around 1800. So the intuition would be to look back again rather on the part of media environment as the major force of changing for a possible next step of postmodernity. So if we are looking for something which Koselleck not had theorized, the postmodern shift, we should perhaps ask again, where's a causal factor which is now acting on the changing of the form on conspiracy theories? And I would say now the media side is again in the situation and in the part of the changing actor. The one offer I could give from my very early modern perspective on your work, which is concentrated mostly on very modern topics or postmodern topics, is to look closely at that structural problem that conspiracy narratives are always using the negative elements of the order at that time, which are important. So conspiracy narratives of the first step order used the negative elements of the Christian eschatological closed sacral time horizon to form the explanatory causal patterns to bridge the knowledge gaps persistent in the new perception of Europe's state system with its new form of present-time consciousness, contemporaneity, and the open planable future. Conspiracy narratives of the second step order used the negative elements of older regime orders as explanatory causality patterns to bridge the knowledge gaps persistent in roughly the same world representation, which has changed mostly through the possibility of assuming general growth and progress. Bourgeois Jacobins expect conspiracies of the old regime monarchy and clerics. Communists expect conspiracies of capitalist defenders of class orders. Later conspiracy narratives reveal political actions as secretly being racist or not gender conform. So that's a movement which is pluralizing the same type. In any way, we must now expect that conspiracy narratives of a pretendedly third period, if that exists, would also take negative elements of the respective older world order as explanatory causal patterns to bridge the knowledge gaps present in and created by the current forms of world representations. And here I'm really not sure if we have something like that already. You know that perhaps better, but if we take, for example, Hart Negri's Empire versus Multitude as an example, which is a weird pamphlet, an anti-globalization pamphlet for those who know it, we have try something like a new actor, the networked global multitude which faces the empire. They reveal all what's bad is in this world as planned and managed by the empire, a conglomerate of US, UNO globalization actors, and their notion of multitude seems trying to create the new actor mirroring the media realities of people linked sporadically and by global web communication beyond any common constitution. On the other hand, that's a quite neo-Marxist pamphlet, which is not very intelligent, but nevertheless, turning upside down the Ciceronian Spinozian populus multitudo distinction, which we encountered in the beginning, it obviously tries to express a world perception which had never been like that. Beyond the solidly constituted, positive constituted populi of early modern times, and beyond even the humankind of modern thinking, which progresses steadily in perfection and including excluded groups to the same level of equality, beyond all that is something like the lately and suddenly empowered multitudo, which in all prior theories would not have had status of an actor. So, and at that point we arrive at the multitudo, and I don't know if that is really a good example. There are many floating conspiracy narratives which you know much better, but I think what we can tear off out of something like those postmodern globalization narratives of conspiracy is the searching for something which would be another actor like that, another actor which would be at the point where we had for the first epoch the observability between religion and politics, for the second epoch the observability between ancien regime and modernity, and now the question is, and that's perhaps your question in Crash and Conspiracy and Democracy, who is the next line and borderline of observability which will come up. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. As usual on these occasions, we ask one of our postdoctoral researchers on the Leverhulme-funded Conspiracy Democracy project to start the discussion by a few comments. So it's Andrew McKenzie-Howard.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Cornel. Okay, so like that. It's a pleasure for me to be able to offer a few comments on Cornel's paper, because in these last years I've often found myself moving at one degree of separation from Cornel. I was based in the little town of Gotha, and many of your colleagues from Munich had found refuge there. And I say found refuge because there's a certain historical precedent in people moving from Bavaria and finding refuge in what was the old Principality of Gotha. Adam Weishaupt did precisely that in 1785 when the Bavarian government prescribed and outlawed the secret society which he had founded, namely the Illuminati. And so that was one thing which I always used to point to when I was trying to boost the reputation of Gotha. On the other hand, me and my colleagues, if we wanted to go in the other direction and perhaps dissuade certain people from visiting us in Gotha, we could always point to the fact that Gotha was home to the German Museum of Insurance. And we would always say that, you know, come visit us, we'll spend the first day in the German Museum of Insurance. And normally that was sufficient. They'd say, oh, we've had a rethink about that and we've had a change of plans and we'll do something else. Which is a little bit unfair, because insurance is, certainly seen from a historical perspective, a fascinating topic, and Cornel himself knows that, because, as Richard mentioned, his most recent work actually deals with insurance and, more specifically, the early modern means of dealing with the prospect of devastation by fire. Now, associations offering insurance emerged on the basis of older forms of communal solidarity, but they combined this with distinctively modern techniques of assessing risk and planning for life's unforeseen contingencies. And I've only had the opportunity to peruse Cornel's volume, but a yet unwritten chapter would be about the link between insurance and the secret societies, because surprisingly enough, these secret societies weren't, as their reputation often precedes them, they weren't in the business of conspiracy, rather they were often in the business of insurance, an early modern form of insurance, mutual assurances within the society that in the event of the death of one of the members, the rest of the society would come together and provide the material benefit and means to support the wife and the children that have been left behind. Now, I point this out because this is just a vague gesture hinting at parallels between the study of insurance and the study of conspiracy theories. Richard also did that, of course, by talking about the fire and that interesting anecdote about the English who were accused, the English Navy, navvies who were accused of conspiracy after the fire in 1842. But yeah, I mean, there are these parallels on admittedly a very general level. One parallel I think which is very important, and of course these parallels also in terms of your own research make it understandable why you have moved from the one topic to the other, but Cornel would simply argue that both insurance and conspiracy theories are products of modernity, and in other words, phenomenon symptomatic of the transition from a traditional medieval order to modern society. Now, even just the contentious of that simple statement is not to be underestimated. Last year we hosted the philosopher Professor Picton, and I believe he actually is close friends with Keeley, but he began his talk here with the claim that a conspiracy theory is simply a theory which posits a conspiracy. And by this definition, conspiracy theories are as universal and as timeless as conspiracies themselves. Now, although the definition has the virtue of simplicity, certainly when you compare it to what Cornel presented us with, it's quite obvious. Actually, I even remember pointing that out in my comments last time, that such a definition would force us to regard an account of Caesar's assassination, for example, as a conspiracy theory. But you can simply observe that we never call the accounts of Caesar's assassinations conspiracy theories. We therefore have to narrow down the definition, and yeah, like some of the other historians in the room, maybe we're slightly biased in this regard, but of course I for one welcome this attempt undertaken by Cornel to narrow it down by historicising it. Recognising conspiracy theory as a historical phenomenon which only emerges at a specific point in the development of a society does not, of course, imply a blindness to its older prefigurations. And just as institutions of insurance draw upon far older collective assurances of solidarity and community, Cornel began his talk with an instructive sketch looking at the forms of community created by, in particular, oaths. And it's interesting, I mean, if you simply ask the question, what in older societies was sufficient to generate an accusation of conspiracy? And of course, also there is that distinction between conjuratio and conspiratio. But the simple answer is simply it was an oath unsanctioned by higher authority. And this oath could be sworn in public, and it didn't have to be attached to any specific plan, but that was sufficient to generate a charge of conspiracy. Now, we can build upon a lot of research. You mentioned it, Otto Gierke to Paolo Prodi, but there's undoubtedly a lot more work that we can do in that regard with regard to oaths. With regard to my work, I mean, Freemasons, one of the sources of the apprehension towards the Freemasons was their whole culture of swearing oaths. The oath, until relatively recent times, was seen as a form of social magic which constituted, or perhaps the more appropriate word, conjured into existence a new community. Now, of course, an illicit oath might generate an accusation of conspiracy, but such accusations are not to be confused with the more recent phenomenon of conspiracy theories. And when it comes to documenting the emergence of conspiracy theories, Cornel has identified the three decisive innovations, which I will only just once more briefly enumerate. This particular relationship of fictional and factual accounts, which allows conspiracy theories to adopt an ambivalent position somewhere in between, in the sense that they apply principles of fictive reconstruction but claim factual veracity. First point, that was the first point. The second point was the emergence of the public sphere, which allowed participants to observe each other and perhaps even more importantly, observe how they themselves were being observed. And finally, this fusion of secular and sacred time achieved by apocalyptic expectations of the Antichrist's imminent coming. Now, of course, there's an enormous amount which can be said about all those points. Let me firstly say that, in my humble opinion, this represents the most sophisticated appraisal of conspiracy theory we have at the moment. And it allows us, it's exciting, because it allows us to see that conspiracy theory is not just something that we as researchers in the present construct on the basis of vague associations and by projecting modern categories back into the past, but rather it is a genuinely real historical phenomenon emerging in the late 16th century. Finally, let me attempt to wrap things up with an observation which in some ways adds to Cornel's thoughts about how the story might be extended up into the present. We have heard about how societies as communities of collective solidarity can be summoned into existence by an oath, which in turn, if deemed illegitimate, turns this society into a conspiracy. Now, can we find attempts to model all of society as a comprehensive conspiracy? Now, we all know that society has been modelled as an organic phenomenon, as an extended family, as something which emerges as a result of a contractual agreement. What about a conspiracy? And if it is a conspiracy, then directed what against? In 1872, Ralph Waldo Emerson's house at Concord, Massachusetts, burnt down, and he didn't have any insurance. So he was reliant upon gestures of community solidarity and charity. Now that's ironic and perhaps even slightly hypocritical when one considers the essay which he wrote about 30 years prior to that, Self-Reliance. And in this essay, Emerson pours scorn upon the thousand-fold relief societies. Indeed, not only these societies threatened his creed of rugged and indeed masculine individualism, that was true of society as a whole. Society, he writes, is everywhere in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. Society is a joint stock company in which the members agree for the better securing of his bread to each shareholder to surrender the liberty and culture of the eater. Now, society as a conspiracy against the individual and against individual liberty, of course, it was this opposition which allowed Emerson to thus describe the relationship in a manner which admittedly is not really a conspiracy theory, but uses this conspiracy metaphor. The conspiracy theories, as they emerged in the early modern time, we heard that towards the end of Cornel's talk, were based a lot of the time on another opposition, namely that between society and state. And as Cornel has pointed out, and we in the team are very aware, an important point in our history comes when the state authority was no longer the potential victim, but the suspected perpetrator of a conspiracy. But given the fear that societies might often refer to a mere conglomerate of atomicized individuals, in other words, from a populace to a multitudo, as you, Cornel, pointed out, and given the more modern, indeed postmodern conspiracy theories have a far more diffuse sense of the other against which they are directed, I think, Steph, you pointed that out also in our Wednesday meeting. It's interesting just to consider to what degree we might have to integrate Emerson's inspired metaphor of a conspiracy of society against the individual into our attempts to understand modern conspiracy theories. Very last point. We've been talking the whole time, of course, in this European context, and I've taken a little bit of a step out of the early modern period and across the Atlantic by citing Emerson, but it's obviously not enough because if we are to recognise the status of conspiracy theory as a truly global phenomenon, we have to do more than that. What are we dealing with? Are we dealing with something which is just the transfer of something created under unique conditions in Europe, or is there a convergence with other phenomena from different cultures which produce their own conspiracy theories? That's a big question, but I expect the audience has other questions, so I'm going to take a back seat and open up the discussion.
Thank you.